Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us for the news evolution aspect of this day of conversations around the fight for attention. I'm Ni'ma al-Bagher, CNN's chief international investigative correspondent. Next to me are some of our investigative team. This is Barbara Avanatides, senior producer, the poor person responsible for keeping us vaguely within budget, so please feel very, very sorry for her. Katie Polglaze, one of our investigative producers, who also increasingly is fronting reporting, and Gianluca Mezzofiore, who is our other investigative producer, and he is taking the lead on a lot of the editorial on our investigations. And I want to start with something very optimistic, which is the fact that we are a new team. I actually was only announced in this role at the beginning of this year, around February. We're still very much kind of coming together with regards to the resources, and we are, by the standards of today's cost cutting around news gathering, actually slowly getting to a place where resources are being made available. And I think that that is incredibly heartening, because so much of the conversation around the fight for attention, our fight for attention from the audience, is often derailed by anything new and shiny that comes along. And the idea is that digital was supposed to kind of push us all out of the way, and now open source investigation that can be done remotely is going to push us all out of the way. And what we are finding, and what is incredibly heartening about the work that we do, which, you know, I'm going to have to be very honest, and luckily none of our actual commissioning editors are in this room, is really expensive comparatively. It's expensive, it's resource heavy, it's time heavy. On a good couple of months, maybe we can pull together a really big investigation every 2 months, but we see the impact and we see the audiences. And that's what keeps CNN and other organizations that are choosing to invest in investigative work, that's what keeps them investing in investigative work. That actually the idea that digital or other ways into this news gathering would mean that so much of us old-fashioned journalists, and I'm speaking for me, not for anyone else up here on the stage with me, so much of what we do is going to become obsolete. And the reality is that hasn't happened. And if anything, what we're seeing from the audience really is this movement towards deep dives. I mean, last year we did an investigation into the ethnic cleansing and a massacre specifically in Mariam Dangalat in Ethiopia. And the numbers that we did digitally actually outstripped the numbers that we saw visiting our coverage of the January 6th insurrection, which is pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. Not only is breaking news very much what people come to CNN for, but generally the idea is that breaking news is where you get the reliable audience. So the fact that an investigation that was off news agenda could have resulted in these kind of figures, well, let's say it really allowed me to be a little bit more boisterous the next time I was asking for more budget. So I think the message that I hope, as we get deeper into not only the how of what we do as investigative and forensic journalists, and obviously I think it's fascinating, but then I'm a massive geek, as is pretty much everyone else on this stage. As we get into the how of what we do, the why, I just want to kind of just put out there right from the beginning. The why is that it still matters. The why is that when we leverage our platform as CNN, we see absolutely concrete story, and sometimes, if we're really, really good and really, really lucky, life-changing impact. And my hope is that that continues to be the message that not only the consumers are sending to us, but that we are able to kind of send to the broader industry and the broader kind of perspective of journalism. So with that, I would like to start by introducing a video that Katie fronted, which allowed her to break down the methodology of a lot of the open source investigative techniques that her and Gianluca bring to our investigations. Take a look at this.
Social media footage has played a key role in our coverage of Ukraine, making us able to identify military movements and also possible attacks. But it's also really important that we understand the footage is real and accurate and current. And so one of the ways that we've been doing this is by geolocating that footage. And here is an example of how our investigative team has been doing that. It was an alarming scene. Russian helicopters flying suspiciously low over an area just a few kilometers outside of Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, with large dark plumes of smoke rising. The man filming says about 20 of them flew by. And at the time this video first started circulating on social media, February 24th, it was not yet confirmed the Russians were anywhere near Kyiv. So our investigative team began looking to verify it. So the most important thing is to establish that this footage is recent. We used reverse image search engines to check the video had not been circulating before February 24th. It had not. With that confirmed, we needed to establish the location. Social media posts mentioned Hostomel Airport, 25 kilometers outside of Kyiv, so we started there. Using Google Earth and Yandex Maps, a Russian search engine equivalent, we zoomed in on the airport and began looking for possible locations. What we then wanted to do was to geolocate it. And to geolocate it, we did what's called a panorama. So we created various screen grabs from the footage that looked significant, and we pulled up various different shots from the footage that showed us key identifiable structures. The main, most notable one was this yellow building here, and there's a small rooftop structure as well. You can also tell that there are some white houses and a grey structure here to the right. Using these screen grabs, we then went back to our Google Earth to find any situation, any location near the airport that matched that description. And luckily, we found this. Here's a yellow structure, and there's multiple white houses, and there's also a grey structure nearby as well. And because of that arrangement, because of the way they're situated, that had to be the location near the airport where this footage was filmed. So we know the date, and we also know the location of that footage. Now, with that verified, we were able to put that footage to use. And so we sent this footage to CNN's Matthew Chance, and shortly afterwards, he travelled to where we geolocated on a map, and he was then up live for CNN, creating an iconic moment where he was at the airport with Russian soldiers interacting with him and identifying that they were already so close to the capital.
So first and foremost, I just want to say that Katie made it sound easy, and it really isn't. They're going through hours and hours of footage, and often it is footage that is incredibly upsetting, and given the impact that the investigative work that we do has, that it's also footage for which you have very little, in fact, a non-existent margin of error around. If you're looking at a frame and you somehow decide that this frame matches a second frame, and that's not the case, the impact and the resonance of that is huge. So I think Katie did a fantastic job of explaining it, but my worry is she explained it too well, and you might walk away thinking that that was an easy job. I think we're both in agreement, it really isn't, right?
It's not easy.
I think one of the great things, actually, to go to you, Katie, about where you are in your career, is that the evolution of your journalism has kind of come up hand in hand with the evolution of open source. How would you describe the impact open source is having?
I think when I first started at CNN with a lot of these lovely people on stage, the impact and the interest of investigative journalism was sort of trying to see beneath the surface, you know, uncover what's not known, what's not necessarily known about certain events or certain individuals. And I think what open source started to allow us to do is that it's a movement for accessibility of information, of making information public. And so if you know where to look, anyone can find it. And I think that kind of detective thought process really suited what I was interested in doing in terms of journalism, because I could start looking at image analysis, looking at the data behind an image, looking at where an image is located like we were doing here. And then using that process and showing our workings in that process, it means that when we then gave our findings at the end, we also had a very transparent accountability process, so that if anyone wanted to then check and say, well, how do you know these findings? They could follow the same steps and they could do the same thing. So I think that's what sort of drew it to me.
Well, I think also when you say showing your workings, I think what's really important to point out is that with investigative work in general, one of the real transitions, and I am much older than Casey, that I have seen is that it's gone from being this kind of back room of the pub, smoky, very undiverse, very old male kind of Metropolitan Police Force, MI6, asset-driven, really opaque world. And I think part of what open source has brought with it is that it has forced us to show the working out. Because part of being able to get the evidence that we need is being honest with those who are out there on the ground. And I think it's also worth noting that when we say it's open source and we're kind of gathering it from the general populace, we verify it. Mm-hmm. I think that's a very important point. We verify it with data. This is one of my most favorite things to talk about, which is that the technology, if I can use the word fun, and I probably shouldn't use the word fun in general about most of the work we do, if there is a fun aspect to this, it is seeing the way that the technology is evolving alongside us. And Gianluca and Casey did a fantastic investigation into the targeting of Palestinian-American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, and they were able to really be among the journalistic organizations that were at the forefront of dismantling the Israeli government and the IDF's official narrative, and that's frankly the most important part of what we do. We want to have a look at this clip, and then we'll have a little chat off the back of it.
The gunfire you hear at the beginning of this clip is key. Eyewitness testimony and audio analysis show these are the shots that kill Abu Akleh. There is a crack and then a pop. The time between these two sounds reveals how far away the gunmen are. This indicates a distance of between 177 and 197 meters, according to forensic audio analyst Rob Mayer. The tree next to where Abu Akleh was shot is also a crucial piece of evidence. This is her colleague Mujahid As-Saadi, another eyewitness retracing his steps days later. The bullet holes on the tree now identified with tape. Military analyst Chris Cobb-Smith told CNN that the nature of the strike marks prove this wasn't a random shot. She was targeted. He said there was no chance that random firing would result in the 3 or 4 shots hitting in such a tight group from a distance of 200 meters. Based on this analysis, we looked for potential perpetrators in the surrounding area. Less than 3 minutes before Abu Akleh is shot, this Israeli military truck is visible within 200 meters down the same road. The number 1 can be seen on the side. The truck can be seen from this angle too in these videos uploaded to Telegram, this time with armed soldiers visible. Multiple eyewitnesses said a sniper fired at them from a window in an IDF truck. The IDF's own body cam footage shared of the operation that morning shows the same military vehicles lined up on the street facing down towards Abu Akleh. CNN geolocated these videos to this location, matching the distance estimated in Mayer's audio analysis.
Gianluca, before I ask you a little bit of a deeper dive question, can you just give your explanation of what forensic audio analysis is?
Well, in this case, forensic audio analysis is basically the idea of calculating, based on the sound that you can hear in the video, calculating the distance between the gunman and, in this case, the cameraman. And this is like a new branch of audio analysis that we increasingly rely on, not only us, but also other news organizations like the New York Times or the Washington Post have relied on audio forensics analysis for the same investigation. I think it's proof of the constantly evolving nature of open source. We probably would have been able to do something like that a few years ago. The same goes for other examples of video analysis, video forensics analysis. and the ability to rely on weapons experts and people from a wide range of expertise to tell us, what is happening in the video, from, architects, for example, engineers. Open source is very, the word itself is very open and transparent, and it relies on a wide array of people who are on social media, and you can tap into to get expert opinion on stuff.
And I think it's probably one of those things that you see very starkly, because when you began as a journalist, it was called social media discovery. So how did we get from social media discovery, which was just supposed to be go through videos, check that this isn't a fake, and then we'll just slap it on air, to something that, frankly, sounds like it came out of the Matrix, right? Like all you think of is these bullets slowed down and going past people's heads.
Yeah, open source has been around for a while. Bellingcat, probably a lot of people in the audience know about Bellingcat. They've been doing this sort of investigation for Syria, for example, but it was very niche. And most importantly, the amount of footage available is not even comparable to what we see now. And the Ukraine war, I think, is a watershed for open source. Because it's when the open source have become mainstream. I think a lot of heritage media and news organizations have finally realized the importance of open source investigations, and they started to integrate more and more open source teams, or OSINT teams as they're called, into the core operations of the newsroom. I think it's not only the technology that's constantly evolving, but it's the general attitude, the sort of mindset. And even for us, I think mentally we're now thinking of ways to investigate a story that we wouldn't have dreamed of like just a couple of years ago.
Although there are stories where we do end up falling back. The investigation in Ethiopia, the Mariam Dangalad massacre, was one of those where they have, to this day, the Ethiopian government has dropped any kind of internet access. And it's quite interesting because what we're seeing is governments respond to the way that we work. Mm-hmm. And even with Russia in Ukraine, so much of the disinformation was around creating this kind of fog of opacity so that you could trust less in what we were seeing online. I mean, that obviously presumes that we're just taking social media videos and plucking them off Twitter without verifying them. But it is quite fascinating to see these autocratic regimes, the fear that clearly this inspires in them. The first piece that we did that was really open source in the more traditional sense was our investigation into the massacre by Nigerian army officers at Lekki Tollgate. They opened fire on anti-corruption protesters. It was absolutely heartbreaking, and despite the fact that there were people there who were live streaming on Instagram, the Nigerian government's disinformation campaign came out very quickly, trying to characterize any of the videos as reliant on social media, and really trying to kind of push back against the idea even that videos could be verified in the ways that we know they can, in the ways that we do. So we'd like to show you a clip from that investigation.
They've killed him. They've killed him.
The Nigerian government denies this happened. A peaceful protest turned deadly.
The police came, we were peaceful. They came and started shooting at us.
CNN investigated the events at Lekki Tollgate the night of October 20th in Lagos, Nigeria. After analyzing hours of footage, we are going to tell a story that is radically different than the one the authorities are telling.
That peaceful protest, Abi? Okay, make everybody the same. Now, where's the flag?
This is Godson. He was one of the demonstrators having fun live streaming the event. He, like many others, gathered in a peaceful demonstration of discontent after weeks of protest against what they called systemic police brutality and corruption. What Godson and the protesters did not know is that the army is already on its way. This is Bonnie Camp. a military garrison on the south side of Lagos. We know through analysing footage they left at 6:29 p.m, heading towards Lekki tollgate. We can see here the Nigerian government forces approaching. The protesters are gathered on the other side of the gate. As Nigerian forces get closer, you can see shots. At 6:43 p.m, we start hearing gunfire. We know this from the timestamp and data on this video. Here's another angle.
They are releasing fire. They are releasing fire.
Nigerian authorities say they fired blanks into the air and not at protesters. But CNN obtained video that appears to show the army shooting toward the crowd. Here, and at the top of your screen, here. In the midst of the chaotic scenes is DJ Switch, a Nigerian celebrity and activist. She is broadcasting live on Instagram.
I wanted people to see what was happening. I didn't want anybody to come and twist the story.
Witnesses tell CNN ambulances were stopped from entering by Nigerian authorities. You can see here people at the scene trying to conduct CPR.
Please explain to me how, in which part of the world do you go to a protest with live bullets?
Everybody look at this. These are the bullets that were falling by our side, that we're dodging bullets.
CNN has verified that these bullet casings are from live ammunition. They are of mixed origin. Some are Serbian. This one from 2005. Nigerian military sources verified to us that these are munitions that are currently in use by Nigeria's army. And in collaboration with the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network, we were also able to procure Serbian export documents, proving that Nigeria purchased weaponry from Serbia for almost every year between 2005 and 2016. After this investigation, the official Lekki Tollgate Tribunal, the Lagos State Tribunal, used our investigation as evidence, and they entered into the record the fact that Nigerian soldiers, despite the government's denial, despite the army itself's denial, had used live ammunition. So it's definitely one of the pieces that we are incredibly proud of. But that doesn't mean it was easy. So, Katie, let me start with you. I know how many videos you guys had to go through, and I know how many witnesses we all had to speak to be able to verify from the different vantage points. But could you just talk us a little bit through the methodology that both you and John Luca brought to this specific investigation?
Sure, yeah. So one of the first things we did, really, when this incident happened, was get online, see what footage was out there. But what we then decided to do was actually put a call out publicly and say, look, we're investigating this. If you have anything, and we may not have spotted it, send it to us. Send it to us in any way you feel is safe and secure for you. And we created a drive where people could start uploading that footage. And what was so important about that, and it's a frequent part of a lot of open source investigations now, is that it meant that we didn't have to identify the person at all. We didn't need to know their name. We didn't need to know their age. All of these quite basic tools that normally we need to verify with sources. And for this, as long as we had footage that we could verify was accurate and was from that time and was from that location, and the metadata showed it was filmed that night, crucially some of this had the location coordinates in the data, we didn't need more than that from every single person.
You didn't expose them. You didn't expose them further.
Yeah. And of course, we wanted to speak to people as well, and that became a huge part of the piece. But in terms of gathering footage, it greatly expanded the number of people that were involved with the piece. Rather than speaking to a handful of sources, we could have hundreds of people sending us footage, meaning that the accuracy of the piece and the accuracy of our understanding of what had happened that night was that bit better as well.
John Luca, I'd love to hear kind of what you would want to add to that. But in addition to that, I think what was also really interesting is that you used these programs that allowed you to kind of roughly understand what time of day. So that meant that you were able to guard against fake videos or any kind of attempt by the Nigerian government to throw kind of spanners into the works of your evidence gathering.
Yeah, and there were also videos sent to us or available on social media that were actually old or were from another protest. There were several similar protests before that night. So we used software to check on the metadata, or we geolocated, as Katie showed in the video. But also we built a timeline with our amazing video and TV editors. Going frame by frame with all these videos, we were able to be quite definitive in showing that Nigerian police opened fire to the protesters. And also crucially, metadata from a few videos or images showing dead protesters were, allowed us to be declarative in our reporting. And I think it's very important in an era of fake news and to debunk the official narrative. I think it was vindicated after the panel, as you mentioned, after the panel said that we were right, that the Nigerian police opened fire on the protesters, that there were several people dead. Yeah, I think it's testament to our work, to the several hours we spent sifting through the videos and trying to tell the truth from the old or the wrong.
Yeah, so we had begun, you could see a little bit in that investigation that in addition to the kind of the traditional open source methodologies, we also had pulled in the more traditional investigative methodologies. So the access and the hunting down of the export documents, the trying to figure out how do we prove that these bullets were Nigerian government bullets. So it was interesting for us, even at the time, that open source does get you very far along. But in addition to that, there are still these, good old-fashioned ways of doing things, the talking to people, the relying on sources, the cross-referencing with documents and data. And so from that Lekki Tollgate investigation, every investigation that we did from that point on became about evolving that cross-section of open source with forensic and investigative journalism techniques. And this is a piece that we did we were there last August, it broadcast last September, and we want to show you this clip, but I just have to say, even by the standards of the other clips that we've showed, this is a particularly difficult clip to watch. So have a look.
This is the Sitit River, a source of life for the people living along its banks. For weeks, the river has been bringing with it dark secrets from the Ethiopian region of Tigray. Mangled corpses are mysteriously appearing here, downstream in Sudan.
We just got a call that 3 bodies were found down at the riverfront, so we're running down to see what we can see.
Garri rushes down ahead of us. He's Tigrayan, but has been living here for years. He's a key point of contact for Tigrayans driven to Sudan by the conflict. Fishermen usually spot them first and call Garri. On both sides of the border, Tigrayans keep a grim tally of those believed to have been executed by Ethiopian forces that somehow end up in the river. This is an awful job, but one Tigrayans say is their duty. We reached the first body on this small island. We must warn you, the images you're about to see are very disturbing. From the binds still biting into his skin, it's clear this man suffered a tortured death. This Tigrayan has been helping to recover the dead. He holds up the body, but the image is too gruesome to show you. His eyes, though, betray the horror in front of him.
They pulled the body out and the stench was immediate. It clearly had been decomposing along the river for a number of days, and he was tied back with a plastic wire, clearly restrained, and part of the skull was collapsed in. It's just a horrible, horrible sight.
We begin to piece together the puzzle. We are here in Sudan, and Wad al-Hilal. Upstream in Ethiopia is Humera. Based on descriptions from multiple escaped detainees, Humera and its surroundings have become a mass detention facility. We were able to pinpoint the locations. Andaya Tabarak, a storage facility. The electric goods warehouse Naked and Mibrat Haile, where electric wire is stored. Bet Hinsat, the old prison. And Daguna, the sesame warehouse. The list goes on. Via eyewitness testimony and satellite imagery, we verified the existence of at least 7 mass detention facilities in Humera, where torture is rampant, and 2 outside town, including a military camp and the Hawaja. These are pictures of Tigrayan victims, husbands, fathers, sons. Many show victims restrained using the same small gauge yellow electrical wire identified by eyewitnesses as having been stored in the electric goods warehouse in Humera. CNN spoke to multiple eyewitnesses and international and local forensic experts. Most of the victims were tortured, executed, piled on top of each other, most likely in a facility or a mass grave before ending up in the river.
One of the other techniques that we were able to rely on in this investigation was the use of forensic science. And in the longer piece, what we are able to get into is that coincidentally, wherever these bodies had been stored, the groundwater was alkali. So actually, not only were we able to be able to state pretty categorically that these bodies had been tortured and had died before they were thrown in the water, we were also able to prove the kind of torture techniques that were being used. And in fact, in the longer investigation, what we were able to say, reliant on the legal teams at CNN, is that the campaign of ethnic cleansing and human rights violations that the Ethiopians were carrying out in Ethiopia's Tigray region bore all the hallmarks of genocide. And really it was the ability to bring together all those different aspects, the open source, the forensics, the use of eyewitness testimony. And the person who really brought that together was Barbara. As the senior producer, you have the unenviable task of taking all this really important editorial that the audience needs to know and turn it into something that the audience is willing to engage with and watch. How do you do it?
What a question.
Why do you do it, first of all? Why do we put you
question.
through it? But I think it would be wonderful to just explain how it happens. And of course, it doesn't happen alone. We have our wonderful photojournalist Alex Platt and video editor Mark Barron, and they themselves become second and third investigative eyes for us. But you are the bridge between the editorial, the open source, the editorial that I'm constantly trying to shove more of into your pieces, and the viewer actually being able to sit and watch this.
It's incredibly challenging. If we go back to Lekki Tollgate for a second, so you're getting, we're viewing all these videos and all this imagery, and it's just, we're being bombarded. So the question is, how do I get an audience member to watch it, to sit and watch from start to finish, like you would a story? And I think that's really, really hard, and it's increasingly hard when it's a story that's being told so far away, where people don't necessarily think they can relate. So it's actually quite basic, because it's about human emotion. If you can make that connection, between love, hate, money, greed, basic human emotion, then you can get that viewer to sit and watch. So Lekki Tollgate started with Godsend. Why? Because I liked him. Because he was having fun.
He was engaging.
Yeah, and everyone likes him. You look at him, he's like, oh, he's having a great time. But then I'm going to tell you that he doesn't know it, and the rest of the peaceful demonstrators don't know it, but something awful is about to happen, and the government is denying this. And so begins the story. And so I think this sort of engaging first on a very emotional human level is important, especially when, for instance, the Sudan bodies, the clip you just saw, is so grim. How can you expect a viewer to sit through that? That's really hard, because people don't want to see that. So I think what's important is, of course, the editorial is important. The tools we now have with OSINT are incredible. They're mind-boggling. But the basics of storytelling remain.
They're in service to the story.
Absolutely, they have to be. Because otherwise no one would watch. Or it would be a narrow audience, which is important as well. But what you're trying to do, right? What I'm trying to do, sorry, is trying to get my 17-year-old to watch it, as well as my 77-year-old mother. So when you have that sort of range, you've got to be able to make it relatable and get them engaged. So the basics of narrative, the basics of storytelling are absolutely crucial.
Well, and also I think especially for someone who is a minority in the world that I inhabit, I came up in journalism being told that people didn't care. People don't care about African stories. People only care about brown people if they're dying. And I think what you do so well is that you do this job of allowing people to see themselves and their friends and their neighbors. I mean, Godson, you know, bless him, is the life of every party, isn't he? But you wouldn't trust him with your wallet, God love him. But he is clearly the person who's going to kind of keep that party going. And does the work that Gianluca and Katie do, not just from the perspective of the editorial and in service of the evidence, but does the work that they do help you in service of the narrative? When they're going through all these videos, does it help you pick up a kind of a thread of, okay, that's my character?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you know, when we again, going back to Leki Toldegate, when we're going through all this material, when we're going through everything, you're looking for something that is relatable. I mean, you know, Katie and Gianluca are doing the hard work of analyzing and saying, okay, you can use that, you can say that, you can do this, you can do that. And even though I keep pushing them, can I say this? And they're like, please. No, you can't. But it's when you see a character, it's when you see somebody, it's when you fall in love, or when you hate somebody, you think, right, that's my strength. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to run with it. So, you know, I can't live without you. This is like a confession. And in a way, you can't live with me because otherwise it becomes too narrow. And the broader we can tell, you know, the broader the narrative is, that appeal, then it becomes more important because more people are going to watch, because more people are going to be upset, because more people are going to demand their congressmen or their MPs to make a change, to do something.
What we've seen.
Exactly.
I want to show our last clip, which is the investigation we did on the ground in Ukraine, in the east, in Kharkiv. Here it is. Cluster bombs. One Smerch rocket releasing many smaller explosives, scattering bombs, amplifying the devastation. These attacks, captured on social media both in Kharkiv and both from the same day, are a clear example of their indiscriminate nature. When used in this fashion against civilians, it's considered a war crime. The use of Smerch rockets are key in our findings of who is responsible, because they are unique to one unit here, one commander. After months of forensic work, we can reveal the trail of evidence leading to Zhuravlov. Using social media videos to guide us, we return to some of the scenes of the attacks, focusing on February 27th, when 3 civilian targets were hit and 8 more on February 28th. We start in the Pavlova Pola neighborhood of Kharkiv. This is shrapnel from those missiles that fell on our neighborhood, Lilia tells us. This shrapnel was found in one of the rooms. Lilia takes us to see a Smerch rocket that fell 200 yards from her apartment block in this once affluent area. I remember the whistling sound of the missiles. I know that the missiles were flying and that they were accompanied by fighter planes or drones.
You can see the hole that it came through. You can see the way that the rocket buckled when it hit the car. You can also very clearly see that this is a Smerch.
It's not the only rocket coming from this direction on this day. Less than a half-mile down the road, another hit.
Helping to situate us, this kiosk, that water cooler, they're key landmarks. The bodies landed here down this road. Those blue doors you see, that's where the cluster munition shrapnel embedded. This video filmed moments after the attack where 4 people, including a child, were killed. Another smirch launching cluster bombs. We know this because one of the unexploded bombs was found only 280 yards away. Notice the date, 2019. Russia stopped selling arms to Ukraine in 2014. This confirms this is a Russian cluster bomb. 1.5 miles away, another strike, more suffering, and no sign of any legitimate military targets. People were queuing for food, and then something just hit. People started running here, she says. This is the exact moment of impact. Look at it again, frame by frame. You can see the scale of the rocket and proximity to innocent civilians. We are here in Kharkiv. Notice the 5 hits along this line from the 28th. They're pretty much in a line, apart from 3 here, which line up with the hits from February 27th. We can trace these lines 24 miles to a point of convergence here, across the border in Russia, well within the range of a Smerch rocket, where we have a satellite image from the 27th showing the launching position. Notice the plume of smoke and the telltale burn marks of a Smerch launch, here, here, and here. In collaboration with the Center for Information Resilience, we can also tell you who is firing from this position. The 79th Russian Artillery Brigade, part of the Western Military District, which borders Ukraine and is under the command of Zhuravlov. According to open-source information reviewed by CNN, military experts and intelligence sources, they are the only unit in this district equipped to launch Smerch rockets.
Since we broadcast this piece, the Ukrainian prosecutors have opened an investigation into Colonel General Zhuravlov in the hope of being able to issue an indictment. What you didn't see in that piece, in the larger piece, is that we were being shelled. And Barbara, your job was to take the information that Gianluca and Katie were giving you about where those strike spots were, and then go and film as part of the evidence gathering, but also as part of actually making a piece while we were, if I remember correctly, about a mile away from the nearest Russian position, which was actively shelling. So you're not only responsible for the editorial, you're also really responsible for us coming home to our families. In that moment, how do you keep all these different competing realities together in your head, the things that you need to pull together?
Fear.
Of me?
Of not being able to put a film together. So it took Gianluca and Katie, weeks, and they had been doing some incredible work on Ukraine, extraordinary work. And it was, again, we were trying to find a through line, and every day we would be looking at each other saying, where's the investigation, what's the through, how do we differentiate what we're doing with the pieces that are coming out every day? And how do we do an investigation, not just show you what's happening, which was extremely difficult on such a moving story. So I think, when we did see that there was a pattern, and then G and Katie were showing me, right, these are the patterns that we've got now. It was so important to get out there to verify ourselves with our own eyes, to film it ourselves, but also to meet with people who had witnessed it, experienced it.
And it was a constant feedback loop, wasn't it? This is what we're hearing from witnesses on the ground. We'd feed it back to the team back in London, and then they'd say, okay, well, can you ask the witnesses this?
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. And in fact, we were taking pictures, and you were even verifying my pictures in terms of the direction, because in that instance, it was very important where we knew the direction of where these Smerch rockets were coming from. So this is an incredible relationship where, on the ground is so important. Being in the field is so important. And being able to feed back, and then in your head you begin this image, this story that begins to emerge, and linking everything together. And again, the humanity is so important. Those people who had experienced that, who were terrified, families, children. It was just so incredibly important to be able to communicate that it wasn't just the technical side of things and pointing to the general, that there were real people being hurt, their homes, their families being destroyed. So it's marrying those two constantly together, which is challenging.
Well, and also the complicity, right? I mean, our wonderful colleague Tamara Qiblawi was able to prove that this Colonel General Zhuravlov was the architect of the siege of Aleppo. And so, in fact, you were dealing with 2 war zones because we were trying to reach out to people in Syria and in Aleppo at the same time. So I'm sure everybody feels incredibly sorry for you, Barbara. So please don't share it with me, because I am about to open it up for a couple of questions. And if you feel sorry for her, I'm not letting her go. So please don't, encourage her to make better life choices and leave me. But we do have time for a couple of questions if anybody had any questions. Have we just bombarded you with so much detail? The lady there in black.
Yeah, so I just want to say that the work you're doing with open source is really fascinating.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering, when you're getting from social media, what percentage is you scouring social media and what percentage is people sending you stuff, and what do you prefer?
John Lucas, do you want to take that first? In case anybody wants to start sending us stuff?
Well, I don't know. I think so. For example, for Ukraine, a lot of the videos we were seeing, particularly at the beginning, where we had to do a really in-depth work of verifying them, because there was such a huge amount. I think we were blown away by the amount of videos we were dealing with, right? I think as the war progressed, it kind of got better, and we got better in knowing how to deal with the noise,
with the volume,
and the volume of videos. But I don't know what you think.
I think as well, it sort of depends on the timeline of the piece. That sometimes if we are in a breaking news situation, and what's interesting with the Kharkiv piece we saw at the end is that obviously that was happening over a period of weeks. And actually, because this was breaking news and we were covering the breaking news and we were verifying those incidents, by the time we then got to piece together a much bigger piece, we had all of this footage already verified. I think, obviously, if people are sending it to us directly, there may be reasons why they haven't posted it online. So there may be a separate news value that if we can negotiate in terms of assuring that their identity is to some degree protected, I think that obviously can give a different news merit. It's often a trade-off, and I think with the Lekki Tollgate piece, it was a prime example of a huge amount of footage was online, but it was adding that separate component of stuff that people were privately sharing, and then adding the human story, and knowing that the person who would put it online was not just a username, but was actually someone who was called Godson and was a DJ and all the rest of it, and really that comes from a direct interaction and someone sending you the footage as well.
Also, if I can just jump in, the other thing is if you tend to do, like we did with Tigray, a series of stories and investigations, then all of a sudden people are sending you things. So because you're building up a reputation and contacts. So it really depends on the story, and it depends on the timeline that you've got. Also,
there is never going to be enough footage. Even if we don't use it. Sorry, Bob. Divorcing me as soon as we leave the stage. Even if you don't use it, the biggest challenge that we face is the disinformation narrative. So when our call-outs for video is public, that transparency really allows the audience to engage with us from a perspective of trust. So it helps us push back against the various state narratives around the fact that we're somehow creating these videos on some sound stage around the back of Warner Brothers Discovery, right? So the more that people do send in video, even if it's just to allow them to understand our process, transparency is absolutely key. I think we have time for one really, really short one. Lady in brown here, if no one can get you a mic, you can shout, but maybe let's be classy and give you a mic.
Hi, I really think the work you're doing is fascinating, and I really appreciate how you kind of set it out and sort of explain to the viewer how you are investigating. But my question is, obviously these are really emotionally taxing topics that you're looking into. How do you as a team, and what do you have in place at CNN to make sure that you as journalists are okay, and what support do you have?
The pub.
Which we don't recommend. And in case my mother watches this stream, I do not drink Mama, I promise. I think that's an excellent question. I think, not to speak for everyone, but I think what helps is that we are quite a close-knit team and that we do this together. But I also think, and I'm answering this question because we don't have that much time left, so I can't throw it back to the panel. I think what really helps is that we see really immediate and tangible impact. And when you get a phone call from somebody who, you know, our recent investigation on Russian exploitation of gold in Sudan, I was just on the phone this morning with some of the kids from the revolutionary committees who have been going out every week and dying in the hope of gaining international attention. And the impact that we were able to have with that one story has made the international community, because they care about the voters, right? They care about the audience, has made the international community re-engage with Sudan, because we've contextualized it for them that, by the way, while you were looking this way, Putin was using Sudanese gold to create a financial pipeline to the war in Ukraine. I think the fact that we can tangibly see that in some small way it is having an impact on people's lives, it keeps you coming back. And I hope that we also trust each other enough to know when, hey, it's time for maybe to let you take a step back. Thank you so much for staying with us through our very, very complicated and occasionally disturbing work, but we're just incredibly proud of it, and we were so grateful for the opportunity to put it forward. I really have to thank the extraordinary team: Gianluca Mezzofiore, Katie Polglaze, Barbara, Alex Platt, and Mark Barron, who are somewhere here, Tamara Qablawi, who is home. Weekends, none of that exists to us. We are incredibly, incredibly boring in the work that we do.